Hello everyone, Yadagaba, Yama Gaidanea, Yarada, Gamilaroi, Yualarai, Dinawan, Bula Malayan, Bula Girabiri, Diran Bandi D, Naya Yala Gidmaga, Winanayi Gadigal. Thank you so much for being here and beginning this conversation with an acknowledgement of country, which I've done partially in my Yualarai language to pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we're meeting. It feels very fitting that we start this session with that wonderful, lovely, inclusive protocol that invites us to think deeply about how we share this country, but particularly how we share the stories of this land. And this is very much a session that looks at voice and perspective and story. So welcome to Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival 2024, and just a bit of a shout out to everyone who's joining us by Zoom throughout New South Wales who are watching through the local libraries. So together we're going to be having a wonderful session today with, I'm going to confess, actually two of my absolute favourite people in the Aboriginal community. This panel is called Bearing Witness, and it's putting a spotlight on First Nations perspectives of justice. So to explore this, we're honoured to have the company and wisdom of two women, remarkable women, Amy McQuire and Ashlee Donohue. Both of them are absolute powerhouses, and I'm sure by the end of the session you'll understand why I hold them in such high esteem. But before we launch into that, and I tell you a little bit more about their bios, I have a couple of housekeeping things, so make sure your phone is on mute, and please don't record the session, but you are invited to take photos if you want to, but do it with the flash off or you will blind our speakers. You're encouraged to share on social media and Facebook with the tag at Bad Crimes Sydney or with the hashtag Bad Crimes Sydney, and so that you can hear more from the panel and off the back of feedback from other festivals. This year we're trialling not having audience questions during the session, but you are most welcome once we're finished to ask Ashlee and Amy questions that you might have, and particularly while you're buying copies of their books and getting them signed. So Amy McQuire is one of the most courageous First Nations voices. She's a Durrumble and South Sea Islander woman from Rockhampton, Central Queensland. She's a journalist and academic and a writer and commentator, so quite prolific in her contribution to public debate. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Queensland University of Technology, so has sort of bridged that world between doing journalism and reportage, but also making a huge contribution in academia. The book that we're talking about today that she has my copy of is Black Witness, and it's a really powerful analysis of how the media covers First Nations criminal justice issues and really the importance of focusing on First Nations voice. Ashlee Donohue is a proud Dunghutti woman, born and raised in Kempsey. She's currently the CEO of Mudjingal Aboriginal Centre, and she sits on the City of Sydney's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Panel and is on the Domestic Violence New South Wales Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Steering Committee. But in her work at Mudjingal is, of course, running one of the most, if not the most important hub and centre for Aboriginal women in this area. She is engaged in a whole range of activities of supporting Aboriginal women in that way and a real leader in the community. And in addition to that, has written this really important book, Because I Love Him, that explores her own experience with domestic violence. So two fearless voices we're hearing from today. So I'm going to start with Amy. Amy, your book starts with an analysis of how coverage by the media, mainstream media, looks at Indigenous issues. So I wonder if you could share with us what are some of the structural problems that you see in the way Indigenous issues are reported?
I think one of the main issues is the fact that I feel in this country, mainstream media has been complicit in the continual violence perpetrated against Aboriginal people. And the original sin in this country, which is the widespread theft of Aboriginal land and the elimination of Aboriginal peoples across this country, was done through the media and through really horrific representational violence strategies like dehumanisation. And that's all across the world where colonialism and settler colonialism has been perpetrated, because you can't do that, you can't get away with that without first claiming a whole group of people are not human. And we're seeing the ramifications. So those sort of representations don't just go away, they continue in so many different forms. And I think that's the main thing, because when I look at the mainstream media's reportage, I see that there is that continual idea that focused around like the Aboriginal problem, Aboriginal dysfunction, deficiency, not on strength and not on resistance that we actually see in our communities. So as a structure, I think it's a structural violence that's not just within the media but in every institution. But the media sees itself as the fourth estate speaking truth to power, when in reality I see them as supporting the powerful. And I think that's one of the main issues that I would see.
And I just want to dig into that a little bit more, because you make that case really powerfully in the book. I mean, what you've just said is an overview, but you get into some really solid examples that make out that case. And I wonder if you could perhaps share with us maybe some of your analysis around the Northern Territory intervention, where you really powerfully make that case.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because I was recently in the Northern Territory and up at Uluru, and I was listening to it was at a specific conference, and I was listening to a few presentations where they're still talking about housing and violence and ill health, and the memory of the intervention is totally not there. And I kept waiting for the intervention to come up, and I'm like, it's not ancient history, but it's made ancient history. And the intervention, in my view, has compounded all of these issues. But the intervention was a very specific moment in history, which was really like one of the worst examples of media-driven policy making, and that's been shown in so many ways. There's been numerous studies on it, but basically predicated on a lie that all Aboriginal men were pedophiles, that Aboriginal space, particularly remote black space, was this inherently violent space, and also horrifically, there were all of these discourses that Aboriginal women were passive, were without agency, and did not care about their children enough to look after their children. And that's what justified a 15-year racist policy. And it was in particular the ABC that was most prolific in doing that. And the reason they can do that is because, and this is stuff like Alexis Wright talks about, there are these continual stories that have been continually told about Aboriginal people. And so when the media reports on Aboriginal people, they're not reporting on the reality of our communities and what we know, which is so far removed from what we know. They're reporting on the stories that have been told about us. So that becomes the truth. The stories that continually go down becomes the truth. And that's what the intervention was. That's how the intervention happened.
And one of the themes, of course, in how you cover that issue is that the perspectives and voices of First Nations people don't appear in that. And it's partly why I think Ashlee's book is so important, because we hear from a First Nations woman a first-hand experience around how she's been through the situation of domestic violence and come through it. So, Ashlee, I wonder if maybe you could share with us how it was that you came to want to share your story and what you wanted people to know about what you'd been through.
Well, working at Mudgingall at the time, when I decided to write my book, I always say that Mudgingall found me. Had it not been for that little women's centre, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now, because when I entered it, I seen other Aboriginal women sitting around and talking about domestic violence, and no one. I come from a big family, a big Aboriginal family, but no one ever said or sat down and spoke about domestic violence. It was just, it was just one of those things. So when I started hearing that and seeing that, because it's a very a lot of shame in DV and a lot of I don't know, like you don't want everyone to know. So I really tried to cover it up, but Ask the question again. Sorry, I got brain fogged.
Ashlee's had to rush you too, so she's hardly had a breath. I'm just
'Cause I
asking
digress.
what it was that you wanted people to know by writing the book. What were the messages that you wanted to get out?
I wanted people to know, especially Aboriginal women that have been through domestic violence, that it's not just them, they're not alone. That you can go through horrific violence, which I went through, and still come out the other end. And that it's okay to speak up and talk about it, and it's even more okay to put the shame where that belongs, and that's on the perpetrator. Because we carry that shame, and that shame is perpetrator's power, because that's what keeps you quiet. So it's breaking that silence and making it okay to talk about domestic violence.
One of the areas that you've also covered, Amy, that goes to the heart of what Ashlee has been speaking about and the areas she works in is, of course, the way the media has covered the issue of violence against First Nations women. And I just wonder if you could share some of your observations around that, and particularly in the context of the recent inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women and children.
Yeah, and I think following on from what you just said is that I think what I observed in the media and what made me really angry and upset was I felt there was such an unsafe space for Aboriginal women to speak when we wanted to speak about violence, and when Aboriginal women wanted to speak specifically those truths that you've written about in your book. And the reason that it was an unsafe space in the mainstream media is because it would be used to pass these really horrific policy responses. And so Aboriginal women are always told that they were silent about violence and that the community was silent, but Aboriginal women in particular, were tasked with breaking the silence. Like, it was always a responsibility of Aboriginal women to break the silence. But I actually saw it was Aboriginal women who were speaking about violence, but they were speaking about it in the way that we knew it. So we weren't saying it as Aboriginal culture as a whole are violent. Actually, we're seeing it as this patriarchal violence that has come. And yet Aboriginal women are always being spoken above and for. Like, you could never just speak about that reality. And we're seeing that now in that, the Rapid Review. There was no Aboriginal women on the Rapid Review. And then we had an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that went for 2 years and delivered 10 recommendations, basically nothing. There was nothing. They could have written those recommendations at the beginning. And so it just feels like there is still that callous disregard and a lack of care. And when I see all of this, all of the other horrific policy things that we see, like child jails, spit hoods, carceral responses, I always think like it just feels intentional now. The silencing, the refusal to do that, because we have women like Ashlee, Larissa, we have so many strong Black women who have the solutions, and that they refuse to listen, and they do these things about this meaningless inquiry, and I feel like that's intent. It's a continual intent. I get really angry about it because
I don't blame you. I actually think we appeared the same day in that inquiry, and we came on after the Barraville families, and that inquiry caused a lot of trauma for them appearing. It caused issues between them because it was so stressful. It was a stressful thing, and the inquiry delivered them nothing, and you wonder why did you put them through that? So that is a real frustration. It's not just we have this frustration that we do these reports and they sit there gathering dust. It's the trauma. But Ashlee, one of the things that I think is really powerful about how you tell your story, you do it so honestly and so frankly and so generously that what you get to appreciate in the snapshot of what happened to you is how complex domestic violence is. And in particular, you look at some things that are often overlooked, like the financial abuse. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those kind of phenomena that go beyond just the violence and the other way in which there is control. Because I think we're starting to understand now that domestic violence isn't just the actual physical violence, there are a whole lot of other layers to that violence as well.
Yeah. And that's the real issue, is that people still believe domestic violence is only physical assaults, like, hitting, slapping, biting, using weapons and whatnot, putting physical harm on another person. But it's all about power and control. And whether that power comes from physical aggression or controlling of money, controlling of what you wear, controlling of who you speak to, controlling of if you can work or not, controlling your time to go to a supermarket and back. Like there's all these different types of control. And in the financial space, perpetrators are very, very smart and sneaky. One of the most sneakiest things I've heard about financial abuse is that men, and I'll say men because men are the main perpetrators of violence. I'm not saying that it's just men, but the majority of violence towards women is perpetrated by a male. What they would do is they would put $1 in their ex-wife or partner's account and then use the characters as threats. So you know when you pay someone money and you'll say, oh, you know, wash the dog or whatever to keep a record of your thing, it'd be, I'm watching you. I see you. Look out. Something like that that doesn't sound violent. But if you're in a domestic violence relationship, you know exactly what that means. And that is how sneaky and it's really conniving and calculated that people will actually think to that degree to cause harm. So, you know, and that doesn't get spoken about enough. And you know, coercive control is out there now, and I understand coercive control, I do. And the reality is that anyone that's been in a domestic violence relationship before you've been physically assaulted, you've had verbal abuse, emotional abuse, some kind of threats done before the actual physical activity, the majority of the time anyway. And another thing in domestic violence, very few women or people leave after the first assault. Very few. That's a research in itself, how many women leave after the first sign of violence. So, you know, there's a whole lot that goes into domestic violence, and that's all now comes under coercive control, which is like spiritual abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, all the abuses. But my issue with coercive control is that there's absolutely nothing different in the definition of domestic violence and coercive control. It's got the exact same definition. And coercive control for Aboriginal women is problematic. Because anyone, again, I'm going to assume, I'm not going to assume, I'm going to know that there's other victims of domestic violence in this room, and there may even be perpetrators in this room. And when you've been assaulted and you do call the police, you get brave enough to then because you're high alert and now you feel kind of safe, and so you'll say things and whatnot. So if they come out with that coercive control tick, you know, what you've got to tick off, who was aggressive? The woman. Who was verbally abusive, or what is it called, offensive language? The woman. And the majority of the time, if you're an Aboriginal woman, you will end up getting charged. And that's already been proven. So that's problematic for Aboriginal women.
And I was just going to say, Ashlee, because there was a long-running campaign to criminalise coercive control. So when this was becoming the awareness campaign around coercive control, the immediate reaction was, we're going to criminalise it. And immediately it's always Aboriginal women, because Aboriginal women, this is why it's so important to centre Aboriginal women. It's not additive. There's an intersection where if you centre the most vulnerable, you are going to see all the layers of oppression. So if you're actually looking at solutions, you're centering the most vulnerable. You see, oh, this solution is actually going to be really horrendous for the most vulnerable, and it's going to be horrendous for most women. Because I'm from Queensland, the police, we've just had an inquiry into racial and gendered rhetoric and thinking in the Queensland police. It's endemic. Racism, misogyny is endemic in the Queensland police. So it was Aboriginal women in New South Wales and Queensland, all across the country, who were saying, no, actually, this is a reality. When you're looking at carceral solutions, it's going to lead to more Aboriginal women being locked up, because that's a reality. And then I see inquests into white women. They've gone to the police. The police refuse to see them as victims of violence. And so that's why we always say policing is not the solution. But it's because of the refusal to listen to Aboriginal women who are experts as well. And there's a refusal to believe Aboriginal women are experts of their own lived experience. And the fact that they could have all these debates around criminalising coercive control without centering Aboriginal women is absolutely shocking, because you see how all of these horrific things originate from, you know, the violence originally enacted against black women in this country.
Patriarchy started, which started the violence against women through colonisation. That's the truth. Yeah. You know, the reality is that Aboriginal women were being bashed, raped, having babies to men that they didn't know, and then having those babies ripped from their arms. You know, during colonisation, there was mainly one man, white man, on reserves, on missions, on whatever you want to call them. Who did they think were making the fair-skinned babies? It's not rocket science. Like who?
That's been silenced from history.
That's right.
That's why
So
you don't.
Who do you think were making them?
And let's pivot on that very important point that does actually fundamentally underline the contemporary issues that we're talking about. But obviously one of the really important things about your story, Ashlee, is that it's told from a position of strength. And I think everyone who is listening to you can see that you are a woman who now has come into your power and your strength and your voice. But how did you eventually manage to escape? What were how did you find the courage to break out of a cycle that, quite frankly, many people don't find the courage to do?
It was education. I'm going to read the part where I started thinking differently, but also, this is going to sound terrible, growing up, my mother, she was a large woman, and so I was cheeky because I look like I do, growing up in a big Aboriginal family in a big Aboriginal community. So I had to, people would pick on me because I was fair and all this, and so I had to, be able to knuckle up and be cheeky, and I was. And so I was cheeky to my, and she used to throw shoes at me because, and then say, bring the shoe back. And I would, waddle back with the shoe. And so this one night when the father of my kids was at Yarbin after party, and he was starting and whatnot, and we got in a taxi, and he was being violent to me in the taxi, and the taxi just continued to drive. I've had an issue with taxis and violence. Not that it's their job to keep you safe, but, they just keep driving and hope you get out, I guess. But anyway, so that happened, and he was building himself up because he'd built himself up, and I think, oh, God, here we go. And so I walked down my hallway, and he took his shoe off, and he threw it at me, and it clipped the back of my ankle and heel, and something in my brain, that's it. Because I believe, and I read somewhere, I don't know why I say this all the time, I read somewhere that people will take as much abuse in their adulthood, that was the pinnacle of abuse in their childhood. And for me, it was having a shoe thrown at you. So when he'd done that, even though this man put a knife at me and split my head, like horrific physical abuse, he threw that shoe, and that was it. I went into, my mother was there, I got her phone, I called the police, and I put a 5-year AVO out on him. And when the police come and got him, he said, I'll be back in the morning. I said, well, no, you won't. And so it was that something in that, like been having that shoe thrown at me. And now other women, because I've worked in this space for nearly 30 years, so many women will say, oh, when he breaks a bone, I'll leave. Or I wish you'd just hit me so that I could leave. So we're always making up excuses as to leave. And that goes along with the narrative that the most dangerous time to leave, you're going to be murdered is when you do leave. But that's because you're waiting for that excuse to leave. So we have to change that, the language around that, so that you don't need an excuse to leave. You don't have to wait for a situation to arise to leave. And then that'll throw the perpetrators off too, because they're waiting, because they'll know, oh, she's going to leave now because I've started, or I've done this, or I've done that. But that was what it was. It was the shoe. As ridiculous as that sounds, that was it.
I think when you're able, I think what's powerful about it is you're able to put it in that context of the how you've been moulded by what's happened in your childhood. Amy, a point of pivot for you in your book, of course, is your covering of a story about a man called Kevin Henry. And I wonder if you can share with us how that changed your journalism and your perspective.
Yeah, it's a difficult story to distill and summarise, but Kevin is an Aboriginal man from Woorabinda, which is 2 hours from my hometown of Rockhampton. And years ago I heard he was locked up in Etna Creek Jail. He'd been there for 20-something years, 25 or 26 years, and had been given a life sentence for murder. And the local Aboriginal community always believed that he was innocent, and there were always these whisperings that he was innocent. And my dad had actually been a Aboriginal South Sea prison guard for most of my life, so he'd known Kevin for a long time. And about 18 years into his sentence, Kevin had actually said to Dad, police officers put a gun to my head and threatened me to confess. And so I started investigating with an Aboriginal human rights lawyer named Martin Hodgson, and we found all of this evidence to show that he was innocent. And we've been fighting for him in so many ways. But the reason that story is so important to me is because the victim was an Aboriginal woman named Linda. And I feel that the miscarriage of justice occurred not just because Kevin is a black man, but because she is an Aboriginal woman. And the police did not care enough about her or her personhood to actually find the real perpetrators, what happened to her. So it changed everything about even the way we tell stories, thinking about that silence, particularly around Aboriginal women who have been disappeared, and also how we fight for them in the media. Not re-perpetrating the violence, so not only speaking of the wounds on the body when they're not here to speak, but also the way we represent black women. And often it's through spirit, it's through their families who are here, it's through that continual fight. And so that is really, and we're still fighting for Kevin, but it's been a long running, and it just changes my whole understanding of the purpose of black media, and it's there to support families first and foremost.
Ashlee, one of the things that you've written about and you do in your very important work is that you advocate that we need to stop asking women why they don't leave and reframe that conversation around prevention. And I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts on that and how we do it.
Well, it's the same with, everyone. The statistic 1 in 3 women will be affected by domestic violence from the age of 15. Why is it not 1 in 3 men are potential perpetrators of domestic violence? The onus is always put on the woman. If you leave a domestic violence relationship, the woman's got to do parenting classes. She's got to jump through hoops to keep her children. Because if you're in a domestic violence relationship, as a mother, you're deemed a bad mother. You're not a bad mother, you're just in a bad relationship. So in any domestic violence, it's always aimed at the woman. Even there's a story going around at the moment where someone famous, I can't even think of it, I can see her there, but they've got this big headline about this man killing his wife, and yet they're glorifying this man as a good man and then trying to bring the woman down, and they do that specifically even more with Aboriginal women. But it's just the dialogue around it, It's like they're victimising the victims instead of trying to say, well, why, instead of why won't she leave? Well, why does he think that he can behave like this? Where in Australia, in today, 2024, is it okay for men to be killing women at such a high rate with little or no discourse or consequence? When the coward punch was about, legislation changed like that. Suburbs were closed down, there were curfews put in place. When is the last time anyone's heard of a King Hit murder? And yet we're up to, 56 women murdered already in Australia this year. That is unbelievable. And they're throwing this money at it and then expecting community organisations to fix the problem. This is a top-down approach. Like, it's got to come from the top down as to this, and it's the patriarchy again. That's the violence is all based in there. And so until men stand up and start fighting for women, nothing's going to really change, because even for Aboriginal women, we're fearful of putting our men in jail because of deaths in custody. But where's the fear for them murdering us and bashing us? And that's any nationality. Where is that fear? It's always women doing the charge, like we're trying to protect ourselves, but no one's out there fighting for us. And that's the problem.
That feels like a really good point to bring Amy in on, because, Amy, some of the really important work I think you've done is also about shifting that paradigm and getting us to rethink how we cover stories about Aboriginal women and children.
Yeah, and I think what I was saying about intent as well, because I just think we're having these continual reviews, Aboriginal women are continuing to be silenced. I've started to think about this continual violence perpetrated against black women as specifically either femicide or particularly feminicide, which incorporates a structure of impunity, because you can't have this many deaths. You can't, in the territory over the past 10 years, and I'm just using the territory as an example, there's been 88 Aboriginal women who've been killed by violence. In that same time period, only 10 white women. I'm not saying that that's good that anyone has died, but that sort of disparity and that sort of level of black women dying by violence. In fact, you know, homicide is one of the leading causes of death for black women. That just doesn't emerge in a vacuum. That's actually a structural part of society, and it's part of the impunity. So also about recognising that it's actually, the targeted killing of black women and women. And I feel it's inbuilt in every part of society, because otherwise you would fix it, just like you said. You would do things to fix it. And one of the problems is the continual focus on carceral solutions, because the most violent institution is the justice system, particularly the child jails, the child protection system. These are breeding grounds for cycles of violence. So it's an interpersonal violence, but then it also becomes a structural violence and a racist violence. You know what I mean? And fundamentally, I see it as a genocidal violence. And the refusal to do something, like even funding women's shelters and investing in women and investing women in being safe in their homes, so even not having to leave as well, those are continually refused to be dealt with. And so I see that as one of the main issues. It's an intent, like negligence is an intentional act resulting in the killing of women, I feel. Like there's no excuse anymore. I feel that it's so intentional.
Maybe this is a good point for us to take a kind of little break from the questioning and get you to read some of your writing in your own words. So Ashlee, we might start with you.
Before I read, can I just mention what you were saying, Amy, is even with the things that are out now, what's it called? Here I go with my brain fog. Those big papers that are written, eliminating violence in a lifetime. But what's the national plan? Before it was to reduce violence, now it's to end violence by the year 2032. There's a national plan to end violence against women by the year 2032. There's also a plan to end violence against Aboriginal women by 50% in the year of 2031. Now, I thought, maybe the women, because there were Aboriginal women involved in writing that plan, that they thought, we're not going to set ourselves up to fail. But there's nothing in that report that says that. So then I think, does that mean that Aboriginal women, we're only going to save 50% of yours? And that then in itself is violent. That's a systemic violence there and then.
The violence of devaluing the life of black women.
We're only worth 50% saving, and then they've got a year to catch up to the rest. Who did they not cross-check? Yeah.
Those continual messages say things to black women. Like there's continual messages that are sent that black women aren't worth anything. And that can be because you hear that as well.
I get upset about it and people go, what are you going on about? I said, well, make it make sense. And even in the organisation that I work for, it's been around for 32 years and never received government funding for a domestic violence, family violence or sexual assault worker in 32 years.
This is what I mean by intent. And you hear a lot of the older women in radical feminists, or women who are on the front lines of shelters and all these things, and they had solutions years ago, and governments won't fund them.
But we do the work anyway. We just do it. So
Mudjingal, that is, when Ashlee says Mudjingal doesn't get funded for that, I remind you of what I said at the beginning, that it is the most important women's service in this area for Aboriginal women, and it doesn't receive funding for any of those things. It's an absolute outrage.
it is.
On that outrageous note, that level of outrage, I'll now change the tone. And Ashlee, can you give us a read?
I'm not going to read anything violent. I had my space. Is it this one? No, that's the violence. Sorry, Larissa, I should have
That's
been.
all right.
Should have been. See, when I think I'm prepared, I'm not. Oh, God.
Should I ask Amy to start, or have you got your place now?
No, Amy, go on, you start.
Yep, Amy.
Okay, I was just going to read, because I was thinking too, I changed. No, you go first.
No, I've got it now. Do you want me to go?
Yeah, you can
You sure? Yeah. You're going to change?
I might change
Yeah, you might change after me. So,
We didn't rehearse this beforehand.
no, clearly not, and I was late. Okay, it was the day of sentencing. Ronnie and I had been arguing, and I hadn't seen him in a week as we were taking another one of our breaks. We entered the courtroom, and his solicitor and my barrister instructed us both to sit in the holding dock. The judge entered, and we all stood up. He waved us to take our seats and glared at me through his glasses as he began to read the charges and my character references. After he had finished, he began to speak. He agreed this behaviour was unusual for me, and he also believed that I was at minimal risk of reoffending. He then asked me to stand up. I stood up shakily. He pushed his glasses down his nose, peering at me over the rim of the frames. Then he tilted his head towards Ronnie and asked me, "Why are you with this man?" I stood in silence. He asked again a little louder, "Miss Donohue, why are you with this man?" He paused slightly and added, "He's an awful, awful man. Why are you with him?" I could feel everyone staring at me, even Ronnie. I suddenly felt a rush of sympathy for Ronnie, who was sitting right beside me. I looked up, my legs felt like jelly, and in a quivering voice I answered softly, "Because I love him." The judge shook his head at me, banged his hammer and dismissed my charges with a Section 10. He then called a recess. I slumped back into my seat for a moment, relieved, disgusted, sad and elated. I didn't know what I was feeling. My barrister, however, was ecstatic. When we left the courtroom, Ronnie went ahead of me. We never spoke a word to each other. As I reached the door, Ronnie held it open for me. However, my barrister quickly took a step between us and directed me to walk past Ronnie. As we walked outside, Ronnie crossed the road and I could see him doing his little thing with his fingers. It looked like he was counting from 1 to 5, something he would do whenever he was agitated. My barrister, who was very proud of himself, started talking to me and warning me not to reoffend. He also spoke to me about going to a group called Al-Anon. He said I should go as it would be good for me. I thanked him for his help and told him I would look into it, but I never did. What I did do, though, was begin questioning myself about why I was with Ronnie. The judge's question kept playing on my mind. Nobody had ever asked me that before. In fact, I had never even asked myself. I couldn't answer it because at that point I didn't even know why. I believe this was my first step towards building up the courage to leave him for good. Ronnie didn't go back to court. Instead, he began a downward spiral. It was 2 weeks before I saw him again. I was starting to worry about him and I knew I was about to enter into the same pattern as before. We would have a fight, I would kick him out, and then I would start fretting for him. My heart would ache for this man, and then I would search for him or physically place myself where he could see me. It was a toxic and vicious cycle. This time, Ronnie came looking for me to tell me that South Sydney City Council had employed him as a security guard and he wanted to come back home. He told me his job would be to watch over a new community centre being built on the block. I was excited for him. He had a new job and I was accepted into the University of Technology, Sydney. Finally, we would be all right, or so I thought. On the first day of university, I was full of happy nerves, not knowing what to expect. Ronnie insisted on coming with me, so he walked me to the entrance. I was just about to give him a kiss and go inside the lecture theatre when he asked me, "Do you think they'd notice if I come in with you?" I screwed up my face and replied, "I think they might." I was puzzled by Ronnie's request and asked myself the judge's question again. Why was I with him? Was it really because I loved him? Was it as simple as that? Something happened in that moment and I felt another shift. I think Ronnie felt it too. I believe on that particular day he had a subconscious realisation that he had lost a bit of his grip on me and I was starting to walk towards my freedom.
Amy?
Oh, thank you for that, Ashlee. This is just from a piece that's in the context of a lot of the inquests I was sitting on in Queensland, and it was three inquests over the course of about a year and a half where Aboriginal women had been disappeared. None of them, they were never considered homicides, and they were all in the last seen in the company of white men. And so they'd been accused of causing their own disappearance. In one of them, there was assumptions she'd gone walkabout. And in that particular case, the white man was just charged with murder earlier this year before the inquest could continue. And very endemic racism from the Queensland Police. So this was sort of written in that context, but it's sort of the end of an essay I wrote about it. And this part was called Black Justice. I do not know how to define justice in cases of disappeared Aboriginal women. So often the focus of the white witness is carceral, and yet we know that the carceral systems themselves are set up on disappearance, and specifically Indigenous disappearance. Instead of reproducing the same colonial logic of those conspiring in these acts of disappearance, we must formulate different methods of writing that can be used as weapons for families in their ongoing fight and as tools for repatriation, not just repatriating the women physically, but also their memories buried under the weight of 200 years of stereotype. I have found a concept of black justice through the fight of these women's families. Disappearance is predicated on the idea of disconnection, of rupturing ties to community and place. But so often I see this as a failed project. Even though the women may not be here physically, their families can bring them back and bring them closer through acts of presencing. It can be the photos on display in the courtroom or in the hands of the mother in the first row. It can be the way that they are grieved for, the way that they are mourned. I see black justice as the chanting of spirit, the spirit that has never disappeared but still exists and is felt across the waters and caught on the wind. Black justice is found in the families who bring their loved ones back from those spaces of disappearance, who say that these women do not cease to exist but are always present. To understand the violence of silence and silencing, we must first understand what has been silenced. And to understand, we must first listen to the families of women who have been disappeared, and most critically, listen to Aboriginal women. We must do so by remembering that the acts that have been perpetrated against them do not define them. What defines them is not their absence but their presence, which is never lost despite continuing attempts, but which lives on in the memories that they leave behind and in those who continue to fight for their return.
We have mentioned that there has been a national policy focus on domestic violence, and you've already provided a bit of a critique of that, Ashlee. But I wonder, as somebody who is at the coalface working with Aboriginal women every day for whom this is an issue, and seeing how this interweaves with a whole range of other issues that you've also touched on, incarceration, child removal of children, etc., homelessness. If you were asked your views on what we need to do, what would you say?
To end violence or to...
Yeah.
Well, there needs to be consequences. There really needs to be a consequence, because right now there's no... I've heard men say, I can do 5 years standing on my head. You know, I have a lot to do with a woman whose daughter was murdered when she was pregnant, and both her and the baby were killed. That man was released from jail. He's now been put back in jail, but he doesn't have to do his, what's it called when they've got parole? So he'll be out again in another 12 months. So this is like a really violent perpetrator. And I get the carceral stuff and the... Here I go again with my brain fog, where you don't want... What is it?
Like criminalisation or...
Yeah, but I'm sorry, but some people need jail. Like, some people need to... and not be let out. And he's one of those people. You can't murder a woman and his child and then only serve... So I think it was 6 years prison. That's not okay. So there's some cases where, and I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly know that it shouldn't lie with community when there's of horrific crimes like that. Because, community organisations like the one I run don't get funding for DV, let alone to do that thing. And I know that that's one of the things that are put forward, that community deal with it. But then what happens then, especially with our community, is nepotism will set in. And we have to look around at other organisations that are full of, different families. And we have to be honest with ourselves as Aboriginal people too when we have these discussions. And like I said, we're protecting our men, but our men aren't protecting us. And that's in any nationality around violence against women. So there has to be a consequence. And it can't, and if someone puts an AVO on somebody and it's breached, then that should be immediate action has to be taken then. Because I was talking to, I talking to you, Larissa? I was talking to someone, I think it was you, and I said, I wonder how many Aboriginal women, it was someone who's on the death review, sorry, Aboriginal women who have been murdered have had an AVO in place. You know? And or even any woman that has an AVO in place and that wasn't seen to. Just recently, last week, an Aboriginal woman was murdered and people rang the police and it took them 9 hours to respond. That never made the news. The only reason we heard about that because of social media. And that again is because there's no consequence. So without consequence, there's no change. And, you know, that goes for all of us too. Like, the government aren't going to save us. The government aren't going to save women. But they can put things in place to help. But it really comes down to individuals. Like, every single person in this room has the capacity to make their homes, their families, their communities as safe as you want it. And that determines on how much violence you're willing to tolerate. And I'd say, if I asked the full room, and I'd say, everyone would say they've got zero tolerance. Yes, until it comes to your son, to your father, to your friend, to someone that you know, and then that line's moved. It can't be moved, because that's when, if you're one of those people that sit around and see someone be violent or mean to their partner, then you're part of the problem. Because what's going to happen then is that person's going to continually be mean and violent to that person around you because you allow it. And, you know, the violence wouldn't be so horrific in this country if we didn't allow it. And if we're going to have these honest, truth-telling stories, we have to admit to that and talk about that and bring that to light. So that's what it is. It's consequence. There's got to be a consequence. And right now there's none.
Yeah, I just follow on. Like, I agree with that. Because what I've seen in relation to the justice, and that's why we speak about it in the context of abolition, is that a lot of the cases. Yeah, sorry. I was looking at it. So what I have seen is in cases where Aboriginal women and victims, where there's non-Indigenous perpetrators, you see immediately a difference in the justice system, particularly in Queensland, but also Aboriginal women as victims when, 80% of, I think it's like some ridiculous number, I think it's 70 to 80% of Townsville women's prison is Aboriginal women. And the majority of them are family violence victims. And so when we look at abolition, and abolition was sort of started by black feminist women, it's not straight away we don't look at these sort of penalties, particularly for violent men, but it's rethinking what safety would look like, because there are criminalised bodies in this country. They're always Aboriginal men, women and children. And so that's where we see men go in as young kids and then they come out and they have all this anger, and that anger is released on those closest to them and in communities. And so it's rethinking what safety is going to look like. I think in relation to abolition, I think we could close women's jails and child prisons tomorrow. I think there would be other things that we can look at around justice and consequences and accountability, and then focusing on, but like that's a whole restructuring of everything.
Like that, it makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
From what I hear and what I take in, I'm just thinking, well, how's that going to work? Like, people are just
Yeah,
going to be
no,
running
because
around
I mean,
killing each
even
other.
Larissa, like with Barraville, like the community have spent 25 years trying to get that white man before court, done everything possible, and that's one of the stories that changed my whole understanding. And you see a suspected serial killer walking free. And so it's more about like rethinking how we would deal with violence, rather than just letting these violent men, because that's one of the other things with the cases I'm looking at. They don't end up in the Supreme Court; they end up in the Coronial Court, where it's all about the Black Death and not about the perpetrators. And that's one of the hugest problems: is an absence of a perpetrator and a focus on the brutality that has been done to the woman, but no one's caused it, so the Aboriginal woman must have caused it themselves. And that's that victim-blaming rhetoric.
Well, the person I was talking about was a white man, and the woman was Aboriginal, and it was because he was belting her, and she reached for the knife. So therefore, that was then not considered what is a murder with intent.
Yeah.
After he put the knife through her stomach with his baby in it.
This is where you see the differences in how the justice is. And people think you're making it up when you say, no, there's a black law and a white law. There is
Well, you know better than anyone that Aboriginal women that are murdered, the perpetrator's nationality isn't registered. Only Aboriginal women. Why? Because then it goes against that, that only Aboriginal men bash and murder Aboriginal women. And we know that's not true. We know that the percentage is high, but it's not 100% true,
That's one of the big issues. And it come up in the inquiry, actually. I think it was like Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service talked about in Victoria, about like 60% of Aboriginal women are with non-Indigenous people majority. Yeah, no, but it's true. And that's part of it. It's the absence of the perpetrator completely. And so the focus is always on the black woman.
That's right.
And there's never justice.
It's her fault that she allows herself to be beaten, bashed and murdered. Sorry.
No,
We could talk forever, I think.
I said at the beginning, I was confident by the end of this, everyone would know why you are two of my favourite people, and why I admire you both so much. Amy, I just want to continue on something that you said, because people do find the idea of abolition confronting. Yeah. And they also find the concept of defund the police confronting. But again, there is a logic behind that, and I wonder if you could share that with us.
And that's something I found. So we also talk about abolition as a journey, and it's only been very recently I've felt confident saying I was an abolitionist because of that. And so there's arguments around the dangerous few. What are you going to do about the dangerous men? But it is more about restructuring society, thinking through police as well. Police are not what you think police are. Historically, police have not been there for safety. They've been there for property. And it's a relatively new concept. It starts around England, and it was really controversial at the time. If you look at the work of UN police academic Amanda Porter, she charts all the history of the police. And the police have always needed propaganda to support its existence. So even in the early days in England, it was always about protecting property. It was never about keeping people safe. So they've needed propaganda. That's why you have all these well-funded police unions and police media units, where there's so many media units are very well-funded. They need it to talk about safety, but police have never kept women safe. And if you look at, speaking in the context of Queensland, the origins of the QPS are the Native Mounted Police. So there's a direct link from Queensland Police from the Native Mounted Police, which were responsible for the majority of the massacres on the Queensland frontier. In America, it starts with the slave patrol. So they were out there rounding up slaves. So it hasn't really changed the policing. So it seems counterintuitive to talk about defunding the police, but when we talk about defunding the police, we talk about resourcing another idea of safety. So what will keep women safe? Keeping women in communities, not ripping women away into the justice system where they're away from their children, not putting children in the child protection system, which is another stolen generations. And that's a huge part of it. Part of the Genocide Convention, which stayed in, was the removal of children into other groups to breed out. That's actually a part of the Genocide Convention. That's what they continue to do. That's a continual part of a genocide. And so policing and the justice system are part of the continual violence inflicted on black fellas. And so abolition, it's always going to be imperfect. There's all these contradictions, but it's through conversations like this that you start dreaming of a future without prisons and without police. And that seems so crazy for a Western mindset until you realise actually even in Western context, it's a very relatively new concept to have the police and to have mass prisons and a mass industrial complex. And I was just talking to a fella in prison recently, and I sent them money and they said, I can get soap now. And I'm like, why couldn't you get soap before? Oh, we have to buy soap. That's money making. So it's actually an economic thing, and policing don't keep you safe. It protects property.
Sure, and I think that there's been some very good conversations, as you've said, about questioning whether it's the role of police to deal with mental illness. Shouldn't we deal with that differently? Should we be criminalising addiction? Should we be dealing with that as a health issue? So I'm mindful of the time, and I just wanted to finish on a very important note, which is we've talked about domestic violence, violence against women, We've talked about the impacts of colonisation. But I think it's really important, what we do see also here on this panel is strength and resilience. And I think it's really important that we don't frame these discussions in a deficit model and that we actually see a lot of strength in our women. We've already talked about the role that they continue to play. And in a way of just kind of celebrating that resilience and that strength, I thought I would finish just by asking you both very quickly, with the very hard work that both of you do, facing really difficult issues every day and hearing really terrible stories every day and helping people through their lived experience, what keeps you strong? You go first, Amy.
I don't know, but probably also, I don't know, it really, like, it sounds so cheesy and cliche, but it really is through, like, the Black witnesses. And even just, like, being on a panel here with you today, it just makes me feel a lot stronger, and just having conversations and knowing that we're, like, there are so many different amazing Aboriginal mob just continually in the fight, and there's so much expertise there. And I think that's what gives me strength a lot of the time. You know what I mean? Like, it's just
Totally.
having, just learning from other mob around the country.
The importance of Black space.
Yeah.
Ashlee?
Mine is similar. Mine is like really my matriarchs. I was lucky to be loved by my two great Aboriginal grandmothers, my Aboriginal grandmother and my Aboriginal mother. And so I always, say that we are more than our trauma. And so to know that they've survived and walked the walk, so I sit here today and talk to people that, I normally wouldn't talk to, it's because of them. And I've also got 6 grandchildren, and they range from chocolate chip to milky white. And so I don't ever want any of them to be treated any different because of the colour of their skin. And there's 3 sisters who you wouldn't, like, they're all different colours. So they're going to grow up and they've got the same mum and dad. So they're going to have different experiences, because I know as fair-skinned that when I walk, I walk down, what white privilege is. I know what white privilege is because I can be given that privilege because of the way I look. But and I've done it with my daughter, and they've looked over her and said, "Oh, are you okay?" And I said, "Well, she's my daughter, like, what's going on?" So I never ever want them, my grandchildren, to ever have to witness that. And also, I love seeing our young women. Like, I think, oh God, I wish I had the gumption at 19 to do what some of these young Aboriginal Black women are doing and getting out there and just making a name for themselves. It just fills me with pride, and yes, we're going to do this.
I love it too. I sometimes feel like an old cat watching kittens run around, but I'm quite happy in that space. Amy and Ashlee will both be around after the session. You can buy copies of their book. Ashlee's Because I Love Him and Amy's Black Witness are for sale, and I really highly recommend them. You can get them signed. But thank you all so much for spending time with us, for listening to these really important stories, for taking the time to give space to Amy and Ashlee. So let's thank Amy McQuire and Ashlee Donohue for their generosity. Gabaninda Yalu.